Okay, so I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Amishi Jha to the Nature of Mind project. And Dr. Jha is a neuroscientist from Miami, University of Miami in America. And she published a book called Peak Mind a couple of years ago, which is a fantastic book. And I've just read it fully annotated, all my little pencil marks all the way through. Really delighted that you could join us, Amishi,
Oh, so,
on this conversation.
so wonderful.
Welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to be here. Slight correction. My book isn't even 6 months out.
Excuse me. Right. Okay. It's brand new.
But I
That must
like
be why
that
I
you
ended up with a
feel
hardback copy.
it's aging much more than it's actually been in existence. So
Okay. Well, it's actually, of course, it is because you make quite a few references to the COVID pandemic and the challenges of being in lockdown and so on and so forth. And yeah, so it feels very current reading it, I must say. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and the full title, just to read out, is Peak Mind, 12 minutes a day to find your focus, meet the challenge, and be fully present when it matters most. So, of course, that immediately begs the question, wow, what is this peak mind? What is this vision that you have for what's the human mind is capable of?
yeah, absolutely. So my expertise, my background, and thank you for mentioning a little bit about it. I'm a neuroscientist, but in my lab, we focus on the topic of the human brain's attention system.
Mhm.
So to the short version of the answer would be a peak mind is a mind that is has full access to its attentional capabilities
Mm.
to be able to do the exact things that you mentioned are the subtitle of the book, to really be able
Mm.
to not just have peak experiences, which is one of the things that people might think it's about. It's actually about the ordinary and the challenge and meeting those moments of our lives fully as well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you talk in the book about the sort of three attention systems:
Yeah.
the flashlight, the floodlight, and the juggler. And I wonder if you might, for those who haven't read the book, whether you might just sort of give a little summary there of your framework, if you like.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
these metaphors, we were talking earlier. I have children, and part of the arising of these metaphors is a way to describe to them, since they were little children, how it is that this very precious and powerful brain system that we all carry around with us, attention, functions. So I just
Mm.
offer them as sort of ways to conceptualize what we know from the neuroscience literature is the way that attention functions. But maybe just to back up a moment, the exciting thing about the human brain's attention system is that it exists in our brains today because it advantaged our survival for all of our ancestors. So it came to be because of the benefits. I think most of us, when we think about attention, in fact, in so many lectures that I give, if I ask people, do you think that you have peak attention? How many of you think that you
Mm.
have peak attention? Nobody raises their hand. All of us think we're in some kind of crisis moment. And somehow that
Mm.
it's just special to us that we're all having some kind of attentional challenge. And as you mentioned, over the course of the pandemic, it's even more pronounced. So, attention, though, is a very powerful brain system that evolved to help our survival. And it did help our survival. And most broadly speaking, we think it exists to solve a very big problem that the brain, as it became more and more of a complex organ, faces, which is that it cannot fully process all the information that is available to it.
Mm.
So even perceptually, there's a very thin slice of our visual field that we can actually get granular and clear information. Everything else is sort of fuzzy. And that's the way that the brain is organized. So attention allows for the prioritization of some information over other information. And when we take that prioritizing process, we can sample what's going on and then use the entirety of the brain to process it. So we have a limited amount of computational power, but if we take bit by bit of what's going on, we can use all of that power to put together what is going on and what actually is
Mm.
existing around us, and frankly within us, within our own subjective and phenomenological experience as well. So the interior and exterior landscape, if you will. And these three systems that you were describing, and I appreciate you saying flashlight, because oftentimes I'll say torch if that's not a common phrase that is used. Um, but maybe we just start there because the way in which we're going to prioritize varies. And that's what these three systems are describing. So how is some information given advantage over other information? And the flashlight or torch is really saying that the way we're going to prioritize is based on what the information is. So if it's this part of space, for example, that should take priority. That's where I'm going to direct this torch. And whatever it is that I'm directing it toward, I'm going to have better, clearer, crisper, higher integrity information so that now I can use the full brain's computational power to analyze that. And then, of course, if I shift it around, I'm going to, as we said a moment ago, get bit by bit. Now, the really interesting thing about that system in particular is that when you look at the brain level, it absolutely is the case that the quality of what you're seeing and hearing, or whatever the sense system is, for example, is better. So if you think about just listening to my voice or your voice, and we pay attention to that voice, at the very earliest stages of neural processing, within a couple hundred milliseconds, a couple hundred thousandths of a second, it's as if the neurons are responding like the gain has been turned up, like the volume is louder. And even if the objective volume is the same, it appears that way in the way the brain is processing it. And same thing if you aren't paying attention to it, it's as if it's softer. So that's really highlighting, just like an actual flashlight, the benefits. We see things more clearly wherever we're directing that flashlight. But prioritizing information based on content is only one way we prioritize. So that kind of brings us to this second system of attention, which I call, formally it's called the alerting system, but we can describe it as kind of a floodlight. And the floodlight metaphor is really because I'm trying to convey this notion of broad, receptive, observational, and not prioritizing one piece of content over another, but actually the thing we're prioritizing is time. What is most salient right now? And in this moment, you may not know if I should be listening to your voice or looking at my screen or over here. And so I always the floodlight is helpful, but also, that actually came about because I have a floodlight above my garage. And anytime there's movement in my neighborhood, or, a raccoon or people walking their dogs, whatever it is, that floodlight will go on. It's like, what's going on right now? This is just a motion detector on it. But we know that feeling, even if we're driving in a car or walking, and we see some kind of caution sign or flashing light. It means to us, be alert, be aware, and pay attention, but not in the same way as a narrowed, focused, privileging some information over another. So the first system is about prioritizing based on content. The second system is prioritizing based on time now. And the third system, which I often refer to as a juggler, executive control is the formal name. That system, and really we use that term executive within the psychological literature because it is like the executive of a company. This system's job is to ensure that goals and actions align. And in the executive of an organization, you're not going in and doing every individual task, but you're just overseeing, you're managing, you're coordinating, you're prioritizing. So at the broadest level, it's not about prioritizing based on content or time, like the other two systems, but prioritizing based on goals so that our actions can align with the goals themselves.
Okay. Yeah.
So that would be, that sort of rounds out the way we think about attention. Most of us, when we hear that term, might default to thinking it's focus, but it's actually much more than that. And as you can probably see, even the way that I'm describing it, you can connect the dots to what we'll be talking about, which is contemplative practice, and in particular, certain forms of contemplative practice, like mindfulness meditation, which definitely has all of these aspects within its purview.
Yes. Well, I'm looking forward to coming on to that, and especially when we start talking about, as you say, meditation practices. I just want to thank you, and thank you for that wonderful survey as well of your thinking, or at least some of it. You mentioned this thing, which I think people want me to ask about, which is what some people are calling the crisis of attention.
Yeah,
I think you even use that term in your book, and I don't know if this is the same as trough mind, but you mentioned people not being willing to put their hands up to having a peak mind.
yeah.
But yeah, this whole area of I guess, well, there's various aspects we could go into it, but obviously distraction is the thing people probably, a lot of those people in that theatre are thinking about, their inability to keep their mind focused. So, I mean, I know in your book you're encouraging us to sort of, in a way, take responsibility for our minds as well. But I wonder if you might say a bit about, I guess distraction and the crisis of attention. Yeah.
Because it's very real. I mean, I'm not going to raise my hand either when I ask, do you feel like your attention is in tip-top shape?
Right.
But to look at the causes for why we may be having this experience is a worthy enterprise. And one of those causes is, I mean, we can point to different things like, oh, it's social media, it's technology,
Yeah.
it's the 24/7 news cycle. All of those are obviously contributing. But frankly, the crisis of attention has been around since attention's been around.
Right.
And even if we could, as many of us have done, go away, be in the middle of nowhere, really silence on a retreat or in nature somewhere, and there's nothing external pulling at us. We left our phone at home. Nobody's going to bother us. There are no tasks required of us. We were still going to be left with our own minds and that internal distractibility. And of course, now we take ourselves back to regular life. We've got both of those to contend with: the internal distraction and chatter, and the external pulls that are very, very real. But the way that I really want to think about it, because it very much is the case that the pain of the moment can be felt. But the way that I like to think about it is this is just exactly the way the attention system is going to function under these circumstances. So when we look, and in my lab, we look at a whole bunch of different groups that we call high stress, high demand professionals.
Oh, yeah.
So their lives, like many of ours, are filled with challenge. And in particular, they're characterized by something that is becoming a more and more common term or acronym that's used in many business settings. And really, it comes from a lot of military and first responder professionals. And the acronym is VUCA. So V, volatile, U, uncertain, C, complex, and A, ambiguous. So VUCA, VUCA. And when a human being is in those circumstances, what we know is that attention is not going to function as it should. It will become compromised. So now we can kind of think about those three systems I described and understand the way in which it may become compromised. So if we just think of the flashlight or the torch, we should be able to direct it at will. It should be able to just be directed. And by the way, it's the juggler that's going to do the directing. There's a management system that says, point your attention right here, and then we should be able to hold our attention. Under these VUCA circumstances, it will not stay steady, meaning it will be moving around, or it may be hyperfixated. So both are dysfunctional, where it can't unlock or it can't stay steady. And this is the other reason I liked the metaphor of a flashlight, because it describes this very important aspect of this, what's formerly called the orienting system, this flashlight system. Under normal circumstances, let's put VUCA to the side for a moment. You can decide where you want to walk. Where you want to point the flashlight. Let's say you're walking down a darkened path. You want to direct it toward the space in front of you so you can maneuver.
Yeah.
But if there was a weird sound or a strange sound or howling or something like that, you're going to take that flashlight and immediately direct it to where you thought the sound came from. Very healthy and normal thing to do. So it has the capability of directing, but it can automatically be pulled or yanked as well. And so these features, that's when I said that under VUCA circumstances, you can't keep it steady. It could be that it's constantly being pulled in these other directions by external stimuli or internally generated stimuli.
Yeah.
And those, by the way, would be people that we might even describe as having attention deficit disorder. They cannot keep the flashlight steady.
Okay.
But in the context of something like depression, for example, the flashlight is now stuck on certain kinds of mental content, and it cannot extract itself away when it needs to be doing something else. So it could be depressogenic or negative thoughts. It's stuck on there. So both of those would be kind of examples of distractibility, but definitely dysfunction. And we see the same thing with these other two systems. Under these VUCA circumstances, the floodlight is not just like broad and receptive to what's going on in the moment, but it's hyper vigilant. You have that sense of the need to actually prepare yourself for something in everything you do in your life. And this is what we
Yes.
often see with anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorders, that amped
Right.
up floodlight on everything, almost blinding you, is what's experienced. And then
Yeah.
finally, under these kind of VUCA circumstances, the juggler is not keeping all the balls in the air. The balls are dropping. You can't maintain goals. You can't shift when there's an update required. And you certainly cannot ensure that your behavior and your goals align. So, a very
Yeah.
disorganized state. And I think that because VUCA is obviously on a continuum, we're not just all in with a very
Yeah.
volatile, ambiguous, complex circumstance. We're going to have varying degrees of it, and we're going to be more in that context or not. And we will see the challenges to our attention. So, we've seen the impact of these kind of circumstances in groups like first responders, emergency services professionals,
Yeah.
medical and nursing staff. When they're under high stress over multiple weeks, months, even years, attention is going to do this characteristic thing of not functioning properly. And I think that is what we mean when we're saying a crisis of attention, especially over the last couple years. In some sense, a global pandemic is the ultimate collective VUCA experience.
Of course. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if we
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
this sense of, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't keep a hold of what I'm supposed to be doing, everything feels scary and overwhelming, and I don't even know what my goals are. It's exactly what, unfortunately, my research had been saying over the last decade is going to be the case. Unfortunately, I didn't expect the entire world to be my laboratory in some sense, where we're all experiencing that.
Yeah. I mean, in my mind, this begs the question, of course, what do we do in these focus situations? Shall I go straight to that question? Well, I was going to, yeah, maybe I'll just ask that. I've got something else I want to ask about that state of, in a way, what one might call overwhelm, or what you call VUCA. Because what you're very clear about is that the answer to this isn't to change your life. And in a way, sometimes you just can't anyway. You say if you're in the middle of a COVID pandemic lockdown, you can't do anything about that.
Right.
And if you want to be a first responder, then you don't, if that's the job you love, it's not that you want to leave that job. So I think you've got a really interesting perspective on what to do with this circumstance. I wonder if you might say, but I mean, I'm particularly thinking of what you said about decentering and meta awareness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wonder if you might say something
Yeah.
about that.
All of it's not just that you can't often change your life, but no matter what, VUCA is going to find you in your life.
Yes.
All of us
Yes.
will. This is what we would. Another way to say it is, this is the tapestry of human suffering, that we're going to
Yeah.
face these
Yeah. Sure.
circumstances, and this is why it connects so beautifully with the contemplative approach, because
Yeah.
we have to accept that as the nature of what's going to happen. And even if we say, I'm not going to change my profession, or I can't change my profession, um, and even if you do change your profession, you will be met with these circumstances. So,
Yes.
finding a different way. And by the way, the other simple thing, not simple, but solution people offer is like, just throw your phone away. Like, just don't engage
Yes.
with
Sure. Yeah.
technology.
Yeah.
Just go live in a monastic environment, which I wish I could say even monastics were protected from this, but they will not be, right? And we know, for example, and I describe this in the book as well, that medieval monks complained that even though they had left their regular lives to join this devotional life, they were plagued by things like, what am I going to have for lunch, and
Yes.
you know and what am I going to do after this particular session that I'm in? So it doesn't go away. And everything we talked about, that I kind of made this example of VUCA as an external thing, we carry VUCA around in our own mind. We are
Right.
explicitly generating those circumstances. So yeah, there are many solutions that we can take, and we must cultivate, because the thing about challenges and difficulty is that they diminish or deplete attentional availability, and then we need our attention to maneuver through the challenge. So the exact thing we need that would help us in these
Right.
circumstances, we have less of. And that's why I do describe attention as a type of fuel. So we're either fueled up, or our gas tank is, we're having less and less available to us. And in some sense, what contemplative practice and these other sort of in the moment strategies are offering us is to keep everything properly
Yeah.
fueled up. and to internally refuel ourselves every day so we have better access. But there are so many different things we can do. And an example would be you mentioned meta awareness and decentering. That's one example of what we might do. And just to kind of clarify what I mean, but when I use those terms, in some sense, meta awareness is that alerting system, but done in a very particular way. So it's broad, receptive, paying attention to what's happening right now, but not in that sort of deer in a headlights, sort of too almost frozen, overwhelmed state, but being able to, informally, this would be the description or definition of meta awareness, an awareness of the contents and processes at play in one's mind and situation around them,
Yeah.
moment by moment. So we're fully aware. Another shorthand would be attention to your attention. The meta piece is that looking into inward. So, and this is where practices like open monitoring practices can be very, very helpful. Your broad receptive stance with a steadiness of being able to take that observational view without getting frozen, overwhelmed, or frozen or overwhelmed would be the two bad consequences of it. And one approach would be to distance oneself. So if you want to look at what's going on right now and not be locked into the story that the mind has created or a particular detail about the environment, etc., you've got to step away from it. And attention cannot be in multiple places at once. So you're either in the middle of a very intense and difficult emotion, or you're watching that you are that the experience of a difficult emotion has arisen. But you cannot be in both places at once, fully.
Interesting. Yeah.
So in some sense,
Yeah.
pulling away, and that's what decenter is talking about, is taking this observational stance explicitly by psychologically distancing oneself. And that doesn't mean closing off or denying it. It's more like, and again, this is where, having children and describing what this is to them is very helpful. I'd say to them, it's sort of like being I don't know if you have this in the UK, but I'm sure you do, like a traffic helicopter, right? So you're hovering above, maybe there's a bit, do you have this? Is this a common thing where that sometimes on the TV, they might have a helicopter in the sky kind of looking down on what's happening in a particular circumstance, like a busy road, and saying, oh, this particular intersection has been blocked
Or
up.
maybe in London. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
So
Yeah.
a traffic
Yeah.
helicopter or a drone, let's say, or a bird, depending on what you want to say,
Yeah.
or a fly
Yeah.
on the wall. The point is, you are somewhere else and you're watching what's going
Anything can fly.
on. A fly, a bird, a drone. These are, there's so many different ways that you could approach this, but the point
Yeah.
is, there
Yeah.
is a distance between the experience as it's unfolding and a reporting of that experience in a kind of third person or objective manner. So it would
Right.
be,
So if you're aware that you're stressed, you can't be in the middle of stress anymore because by definition there's distance, and therefore you're in a sense. This is what I guess what you mean by decentered. You're not centered anymore in the middle of that stress. You're observing it from above, and therefore in that sense you're not stressed in that moment,
well,
so to
you
speak.
are going to be, well, you are and you aren't, right? So you're basically, if you think about what kind of at a granular level would happen, you're in the middle of a very overwhelmed situation. You've got a deadline, you can't make it, and you feel that like, I'm never going to get this
Yeah.
done. That internal chatter starts building up. And then you're so lost in the internal chatter that you're not even doing the thing that is the cause of that stress, which is getting the project done,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
you see that you're in a loop, like you're stuck, you're overwhelmed, you're almost paralyzed. And so then that would be the moment to say, maybe I need a little bit of distance here. And so the distance would be not denying the moment. It's just
Mm.
taking a little pause away from that direct experience of it and saying, what is actually going on in this moment? Amishi is feeling that she will not make this deadline. Amishi
Mm.
cares about this deadline. She's feeling
Mm.
whatever. She's feeling tightness in her jaw or her heart's beating faster. I'm using a third person perspective. So because I'm watching
Yeah.
it, I'm the reporter watching what's going
Yeah.
on. I'm describing it factually, I'm not justifying, conceptually elaborating. It's like if I weren't me and I had to see, if I was watching the situation, what could I say is going on if I were just taking a kind of a raw data of the experience. And just doing that does provide that psychological distance, but it also kind of dials down the intensity of the directly experienced emotion. And then you can kind of get your head back together to say, okay, now where do I need to focus to get this report done? But so it's not denying or not experiencing it. It's just
Yeah.
experiencing it from this other perspective.
Yeah. Well, so some of what you're saying, I can somewhat I can imagine some of my Buddhist friends saying, "Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that idea," or maybe even do it a bit. What you can bring to this that none of us can is that you've got actual laboratory evidence of the impact of this type of awareness, what you're calling meta awareness. And I'd be really interested. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of, if you like, evidence? A really striking bit of evidence from your research that really sort of backs this up.
Yeah, I mean the broader evidence from all of the, essentially, if we look at contemplative practice, in particular mindfulness training, we can find research that suggests that the flashlight is stronger. You can direct it willfully better.
Right.
You find that the
Right.
floodlight can observe, whether it's at a distance or just with granularity of the situation going on, better. And the juggler is able to maintain the goals and align behavior better. So that's the
Yeah.
sort of broadly speaking, the powerful evidence
Yeah.
that we see when it comes to meta awareness, which is what we're cultivating in a way with psychological distancing. They're yoked; they're not the same thing. Is improvements in psychological health, improvements in things like the likelihood, and this is beautiful work done in the UK. Um, Reduced rates of recurrence of intractable depression, for example.
Right.
And even when we look directly at the brain, we see that there's a dialing down of activity in brain regions tied and more active during emotional overwhelm. So strong emotional responses seem to be less prevalent under this decentered approach, without sacrificing the memory for the experience, which is very important. It's not like you're dulling out. You actually can get better granular accounts of what's going on, but because you're not so overwhelmed, you're actually even able to see the details of a situation better.
Yeah. I'd really love to. Is that all right? Can I move on to this next question? Is
Please,
that?
please, yeah.
Yeah, I'd really love to ask about this because you do. There's a lovely, lovely isn't the right word, but really powerful section actually in the book about memory.
Mm.
And personally, I'm someone who's not got brilliant memory, but one of my childhood friends teases me about it, that I don't remember things that we did together. And you tell a similar story in your book about one of your, I think it was an army officer who had a similar experience with his own children, where he was forgetting memories and forgetting experiences that they'd had together. And my understanding of what you're saying is that when one is living with constant mental engagement, from minute to minute, from the moment one wakes up to the moment one goes to sleep, and doing a lot of what we call multitasking, but you call task switching, when we're living in that kind of constant kind of activity without any kind of breaks, then our kind of working memory, so to speak, or I think you call it a mental whiteboard, just fills up, and then we're actually far less likely to I think you use the word encode memories, that those experiences are not, and that the only time we can encode them is now. There's no point taking a photo and saying, I'll look at it at the weekend. It has to be now. I'm really interested if you could say a bit more about that, about this kind of overload of the working memory through this constant activity and how that impacts on well, remembering our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say that what we're finding is that it's not that, even the example I gave of the service member who, yeah, it was the anecdote that he shared was that he was with his children, and they're recounting events that they know he was physically present for. I mean, he was there, he's sitting with them, he's in the
Yeah.
photograph, but he has
Yeah.
no actual memory of the
Mm.
experience himself. And it's not that he forgot. That was the insight that came from our conversation. It's that he wasn't there when he was there. He was not encoding what was going on in that moment. It's not that he had it encoded and then it drifted away. That is an organic memory challenge. I mean, forgetting is a thing that can happen, which also has its power. But what
Mm.
we surmise is going on, and we know happens when we look at other studies of people that are overwhelmed and what we'd call mind wandering, meaning having off
Mm.
task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. It's a very technical, it's not just your mind is meandering, it's that it's actually not present to what's going on in the moment.
Mm.
When mind wandering is occurring, you are missing the experience as it's occurring, because your mind attention can only be in one place at one time. So if the flashlight is not pointed to the external environment, the people around you, the circumstances, but it's actually gripped by something internal, a preoccupation, a worry, planning, troubling memory, you will miss all that's occurring around you because it's not present to you. So,
Mm.
another way to say this is attention is the doorway by which we remember information. And if attention is not
Mm.
available in a moment, it will not allow you to encode information. So the trajectory would be you pay attention to what's going on in the moment. It then allows you to put it on this mental whiteboard, a temporary scratch space, and then it can go into long term memory. So it's
Mm.
not that it's in long term memory and sometimes it somehow it disappears. It never made it fully onto the whiteboard
Yeah.
because what was on the whiteboard was wherever that flashlight was pointing. Like I said, ruminating about a past event or
Mm.
catastrophizing about a future event. And that's what this service member said to us. It's like, yeah, I wasn't there because my mind was not there. I wasn't even aware of what was happening around me. I was really preoccupied about
Mm.
something else. I was mind wandering. So
Yeah.
when we get that sense, we realize, oh, maybe there are reasons why I don't remember certain experiences. I was somewhere else. Even though I'm in the photo, I was somewhere else when it was transpiring. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
that goes with what you were saying about don't take a photograph and think about encoding it, that you'll remember it later. You will not remember it later. You missed
Mm.
your chance. It's something called episodic memory, which means you are encoding the episode, the lived phenomenological experience of the episode as it's occurring. And if you miss your attention being available in the moment, that's it. The moment is gone.
Well, in fact, I think you even said in the book that you've done studies, or there have been studies where if you take a photo of an experience, you're less likely to remember it than if you didn't.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is
Yeah.
very intriguing data because it's so counterintuitive. Like there were some studies done where people even went to museums and had to either they could choose to take photographs, or in some instances were asked to not take photographs, or actually take photographs to share later versus for their own personal memory of
Mm.
it. And it was always when it was in the moment, tied to directly experiencing it, that the photograph was aligned with better memory for the episode itself. So,
Oh, rather than to be shared later. Oh,
yep,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
exactly. And part of it
yeah,
is oftentimes when we are taking a photograph, we're so preoccupied about the technological requirements of being able to do it that we're actually not experiencing the scene. We're managing the process of getting the photograph taken.
yeah,
Or other
yeah,
times we're just phoning it in, so to speak. We're just getting the photograph and we've been thinking about
yeah.
something else the entire time.
Or been getting fascinated about sharing this with our friends and how jealous they'll be, or whatever,
But even that is
whatever
not
the
being in the moment, right? So you are just not there.
exactly.
You're
Yeah,
already thinking about the
that's
future.
it.
So yeah.
That's it. Yeah, yeah. And the other thing you said that in your book that can happen when this mental whiteboard is just kind of constantly full. I don't know if I'm using the right metaphor here, but constantly full is also more emotional reactivity, less emotional regulation. Would you mind saying a bit about that?
Yeah. Now this is, the whiteboard is really curious because this brain capacity of working memory, just to kind of clarify what that means. Long-term memory is what we'd say sort of the hardened representation. So if I ask you, do you remember what your primary school looked like from the outside? You're like, it's not at the top of your mind, but if you took a moment, you'd be like,
Yeah,
yeah, I
and dig it
remember.
out. Yeah,
So what happened in that moment? I mean, somehow not somehow, we know how, we think it's stored in long-term memory, but my cue to you that says pull that memory up. You were able to kind of access that memory. And what
yeah,
happened that allowed you to even have the mental image in this moment, when I said, think of what your primary school looked like, is it went onto your mental whiteboard. It was moved from long term memory into working memory. And working memory is this temporary scratch space like a mental whiteboard, but it's peculiar. It's a whiteboard with disappearing ink. So unless you redraw it over and over and over again, like a 2 second, like let's say 5 minutes later, I say, do you remember what your primary school looked like? It would take you less long to remember it in a moment, but it would still take you some time. It wouldn't be immediate, right?
yes,
So you're putting things on your whiteboard from long-term memory, but you're also putting things onto the whiteboard from this attentional doorway. That flashlight, in some sense, is getting it onto the whiteboard. The whiteboard is like an actual whiteboard in that it's limited. It's not an unlimited space. It's quite
mm,
a constrained size, and it's constrained in time because the ink will disappear. So we can only have so much on our whiteboard. And yes, if we throw random things on there that are not related to the moment, we won't encode the memory. We won't remember it later because it never made it onto the whiteboard to then get into long-term memory. And this is obviously I'm giving you a very simplified, there's a lot of nuance to this. So if anybody with a neuroscience background is listening to me, they'll be like, there's other instances where that might not happen. Absolutely. But I'm just saying it's one way to conceptualize all of this in terms of the challenge with overwhelm and attention, and going to your question regarding emotional reactivity. But in some sense, when we have less attentional fuel, and what I mean by that is that somehow the input systems, the attentional systems, are not working properly. The whiteboard is cluttered with mental content we've generated internally. So now, the flashlight's maybe even pointing at something, but there's so much other stuff on here already that you're ruminating on. For example, there's no space for the new information to come in. And, you can think about it like this. If you're at let's say some kind of a social gathering and you have to give a speech, and you just somebody told you 5 minutes ago, you're going to have to give a speech. We want you to say something about this. So you're kind of trying to get it in your head of like what you're going to say. And then you're introduced to all these people coming in. Oh, please meet this new person and this new person. Right. And they're saying their names to you and they're talking to you. There's so much preoccupation right now as you're mentally rehearsing and crafting that speech that you probably will not remember the names of any of these people. You might have some vague familiarity that their face looks familiar, but you cannot do both things at once, because if the whiteboard had no preoccupation, sure, you could hear the name, see the face, get it on the whiteboard, and might have better chances of making it into long-term memory. But when there's already stuff going on in there, no way is it going to make it. And oftentimes it's not about giving a speech that our whiteboard is preoccupied. It's some event that's already occurred that we're ruminating on, bringing it up over and over again. Or it's a catastrophic, worrisome thought that keeps keeping the whiteboard cluttered. So, I think understanding the mind in this way can be helpful, because then we don't just feel like we're somehow failures. Our brain is not broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Whatever is the center of our conscious experience is going to be what's on the whiteboard. And new information will be challenged of getting into our long-term memory when that's the case. But now you can actually, knowing this, you can actually kind of use your meta awareness to view what is actually on your whiteboard. Like, the reason I don't know what's going on around me is I'm preoccupied about, this upcoming demand I have on me, or I'm so sad right now that all I'm thinking about over and over again is this difficult memory. And then you can do something about it. This is where the meta awareness can lead to this decentering approach of what if we take a moment and allow this experience that's happening on the whiteboard to occur, but I watch what's going on. What you'll notice is that the compulsion to redraw, because that's what you're doing at the whiteboard. You're drawing writing some preoccupying thought, and then you're writing it again, and then you're writing it again, and it feels like the loop of rumination. And that's what you're doing, is you're keeping active. You are an actual participant in the rumination. It's not happening automatically. But when you take that distance perspective and you watch what's going on, the ink will fade, and it will do its normal course, because you've broken the cycle of constantly reactivating that difficult thought.
Yeah, I want to ask you about mind wandering. Thank you. You've mentioned it because you're quite down on mind wandering, of course, in the sense of that rumination, of course, which is I totally understand. And you also have this notion of, in a sense, positive mind wandering. I think you call it positive daydreaming in your book, but like these pauses or empty spaces that you're saying are so crucial in a day. So in a way, that would be the antidote to that constant mental engagement we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Would you mind saying about, and of course, this is something we resist because it's boring, right? You give the example in your book, which is a great one, of, being in the checkout line at the supermarket, and, using the time to check some messages and check an email instead of just standing there. So can you say a bit about this? Because I've really tried to do this as a bit of a practice, is to create these pauses and empty spaces. Coincidentally, 12 minutes a day was my I do a 12-minute block was my precept, if you like.
Oh.
So hard because the mind just doesn't want to stop for 12 minutes and do nothing.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I'd be really interested. Actually, there's two parts to this question. Why do you think that's so important? and also why is it so hard?
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, let's start with why it's important.
Yeah.
So, the broader category of what we've been talking about is mind wandering or mental chatter or internal arising of thought, feeling, sensation, whatever it is. Um, we could say is spontaneous mental activity. It's just the thing that shows up in the mind, and really spontaneous thought is the way we think about it. So we might not even understand why, but some thought mental content arises, and then we do something with it. We either keep it active, or we try to push it away, it won't work, or we let it dissipate, and then it arises, something else arises, and that's the nature of the mind. I mean, we really consider the mind as a thought pump. It's just pumping it out, and if you are conscious and awake, you're going to have spontaneous thought arise. So, I mean, the first thing to say is, if you have any notions that you're going to clear your mind and not have that occur, you will fail, and it will be a waste
Yeah.
of your time, because you're denying the nature of the mind.
Oh,
So the distinction I'm making is, as I'm saying that mind wandering is when that mental content arises, as it will, and then it's sort of fueled through our attention to keep it more and more active in the context of actually needing our attention to be somewhere else. So off task thoughts during an ongoing task. My intention right now is to have this conversation with you. But
yes.
if I'm actually thinking about, oh my gosh, it's so raining outside, how am I ever going to go be able to pick up my
Yeah.
daughter? I'm not going to have a very fulfilling conversation. You're not going to feel fulfilled
Yeah.
in this conversation, but you're going to get the
Right.
sense of, like, where is she? She's not really
Yeah.
listening to my questions. And I wouldn't be, right? I'd actually be having this internal conversation with myself.
Yeah.
So that would be
Yeah.
off task thought. And when we have mind wandering defined in that very specific way, off task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity, we see more errors are made. Memories are not
Mm,
as strong. Decision making becomes faulty and almost irrational, and
mm,
emotional reactivity can arise.
mm.
So there are definitely negative consequences to mind wandering. And when you said I was sort of down on it, it's just stating the reality that it will cost us to mind wander
Yeah.
when we fully intend for our mind to be somewhere else. But the flip side of that is, remember, don't deny that the mind is a thought pumping entity, and
Mm,
if we don't allow spontaneous thought to emerge, we will also have consequences. Meaning, we
mm,
think, it's a question of, why does the mind do this? Why is it a thought pump? Why does mental content sputter in our mind over and over again? And there are many reasons we think this might be happening. One is actually tied to something very fundamental, which is, it may be part of the machinery of how we form memories. So we were talking about memories a
mm.
moment ago. Um,
Yeah.
and when we experience something, obviously I was talking about it getting on the whiteboard, etc. But then the way long-term memory happens is that it's going from a state. Again, I'm going to say, caveat, this is simplified for a broad, intelligent audience. When we have a memory, when we're trying to remember something, it has to be attended to. It goes on this mental whiteboard. And then essentially what it means to go into long term memory, there's no box it's going into. It's just that neurons go from just being activated to actually structurally connected to each other in a more efficient manner. So a hard
Mm,
coded memory would mean it's changing the structure of the brain to allow for memory to
mm,
occur. Now, structural changes don't happen like this. They happen through repeated, sort of like neurons that fire
mm.
together, wire together. So there has to be some
Oh,
way
yes.
for that firing to happen. So we want, one of the things that we know that this happens over sleep is that we experience something, and then during sleep they'll fire together. So all these little events we've had all day, they may be allowing for
Yeah.
memory to occur through this process called memory consolidation. But even as we're awake and nothing else is occupying us, that the neurons will be doing their thing. And so when we feel the arising of a thought, it may be that this little bundle of neurons are firing together, and it arises to the point of conscious acknowledgement of a thought. So the first thing to say is, if you never allow that white space in your life where you're always doing task to task to task to task, just like you said in the context of standing in line at a
Mm,
grocery store, you may be denying your opportunity for spontaneous thought that may support your own
mm.
memory to later be better represented.
Yeah.
So that's one consequence. The other thing is that we know when people don't have these white spaces, and I just mean by white spaces, there's no task. It's not that you're having off task thought, it's that you don't have a dedicated task that you're trying to do. It's almost like giving the juggler a break, saying, you don't have to
Yeah.
manage right now, just there is no requirement, right? And so if we think about this as what you do when you say you're daydreaming, right? Usually you're sitting or walking somewhere. There's no particular thing you need to figure out, or you don't even have a particular recurring thought or worry. It's just letting the mind do whatever arises. If the sound of a bird captures your attention, oh, look at that, a bird. Or you have some some kind of grumbling in your stomach, oh, look at that, I might be hungry. You're just allowing the mental content to appear, and you're not constraining it or controlling it in any way. When people do this, not only will their memory likely be better, but we know that their mood is going to improve. We know that their creativity may be better supported, and they'll feel sort of this sense of I don't know, general positivity and buoyancy, mentally buoyant. So there is a real value in doing it, and this is where I think the cost of a highly technological 24/7 life can be very problematic, because it may not feel like it, but what you're doing when you pick up your phone and you look at it is you are now in a task context. The task is, whether it's even something you think is fun, like, oh, I'm just going to go on social media and see what's going on. Well, now the task is
Yeah.
observe what's going on, engage
Yeah.
with it. If you have some kind of feedback from something you've written, respond to it, catch up with what somebody's posted, etc. So or if it's email, forget it. That's very
Yeah.
tasks focused,
Yes.
because you're
Of
actually
course,
having to think and generate, and you are not giving this spontaneous thought any moments to arise, and it will cost you in some sense. So that's
So, what
the
are the
first
kind
part.
of things you can do?
Yeah.
You mentioned you can use. I know there's still that other question pending of
Yeah.
why is it so hard. But what are the kind of things you mentioned? You use this word procedural activities like walking. What are the kind of things you can do? Okay, you can't check your social media. That doesn't count as a positive mind wandering chance. But what can you
Well,
do?
I think that the key is that there's no particular task, low attentional demand.
Right.
So the reason taking a walk,
Right.
if you, by the way, it would not be no task if you were going to take a walk on the edge of a cliff. Right?
Right.
That is going to take a lot of focus. So it's not just the act of walking that makes it open.
Or charging to the shops before they close.
Right. Right. It's something
Right.
that's not going to take a lot of willful, planful. Basically, the flashlight doesn't need to be
Yeah.
pointed anywhere in particular.
Right.
Floodlights just kind of
Right.
checking
Right.
out
Right.
what's going on, and the juggler does not have any goal it needs to accomplish.
Yeah.
So low
Yeah.
attentional demands. Walks in nature are fantastic for multiple reasons.
Yeah.
But of course, if you spend your time walking in nature preoccupied about the thing, you're no longer benefiting from that spontaneous thought. So it's not just about the context,
Yes.
it's about the mental way you're going to approach the
Yes.
context. Because frankly, even a walk through a busy cityscape can have that quality. It's just the way you're holding your
Yeah.
mind, in the way that allows it to have the buoyant, free flow of spontaneous thought arise.
And as a neuroscientist, do you have an answer to that other question? Like, why is that so hard? Like, why do we get, what, in a sense, what is boredom?
Yeah,
What is that?
yeah. In many ways, it's interesting because people think of boredom as the cause for something. Like, well, it's the reason I have to stop doing this because. But I don't think that's why. I don't know. This is now I'm speculating. I think
Okay.
boredom is a feedback system. So we as human beings needed some way to snap us out of what we're doing to see the opportunity costs before us. And by opportunity costs, I mean, what else could I be doing right now? Or should
Yes.
I be doing right now?
Yeah.
To even ask the question, I need to turn my attention somewhere else. There had to be something that was slightly noxious in our phenomenology that would say, this is not comfortable. I need to switch. So
Right.
why does that this is not comfortable feeling arise? Partly it just could be that doing the same thing over and over has an aspect of that to it as a mechanism to get you to check out that you don't, in our evolutionary ancestors' days, don't get eaten, make sure you're aware of the weather,
Oh,
take shelter
sure.
if you need to,
Yeah.
just something that arises that cues you that says, what's going on right now? Is there something else I should be doing instead? That, I think, is what we consider now boredom. Because boredom is essentially
Right.
saying to us, the current situation is unsatisfactory and action must be taken. Right? So if we
Yeah.
realize, it's the mind showing me that feedback, we can make a choice in that moment. I
Yeah.
mean, sure, the feedback is boredom. There's nothing intrinsic in some sense about that feeling is just a feeling like any other. And I can question and determine what I want to do based on its arising. And so, I mean,
Okay.
if you think about doing an extended meditation retreat, there's many times that it's, your instinct might be to run out of the hall and just run back to your car and just get in. And I've definitely had
Yes.
that feeling like I
Yes.
can't take it anymore. Usually in the first couple of days, then it's like, why would I ever want to go
Yeah.
back to that anything, right? It's so things can shift, but
Yeah.
if you realize,
Yeah.
yes, that is the strong feeling occurring because this is so um, not in line with what I might typically be doing, or there's an edginess or an energetic sort of frenetic quality to the momentum of
Yeah.
my life, and I'm resisting it. So, but if we start thinking
Yeah.
boredom as the feedback instead of the cause for anything, it can really help
Oh,
us
interesting. Yeah.
free up what we do next based on its arising. Because,
Yeah. Yeah.
think about the many circumstances for many professions where it doesn't matter if you're bored. If you're in the middle of surgery and you have that boredom feeling arise, you can't just drop your tools and leave, or in the middle of fighting a fire, or in the middle of
Yeah.
surveying a particular part of the city as a first responder, or in as a nurse or physician monitoring equipment, like
Yeah.
there, or a baggage screen. I mean, you could think of all of these
Yeah.
contexts, or
Yeah. Yeah.
or a parent watching your children play the same game the thousandth
Yeah.
time. There are moments
Yes.
where the feedback may arise, but we choose to do something else with that feedback, like yes.
Yeah.
And so the same thing with standing in line at the grocery store. The default may be, because we've trained ourselves, frankly, like you stand in line, you pull out your phone. There should be no moments where I'm not actually engaged in a task. And then you might interpret that as I'm bored right now. And instead say, I'm going against the grain of what the mind may do in an unconstrained way, but I'm choosing not to do that. What does it feel like if I just
Yeah.
leave the phone in my
Yeah. Yeah.
pocket? What if I actually use this opportunity to not have the flashlight pointing at the phone, but just take a survey of what's happening around me? And it's
Yeah.
not like we might be able to do that for every moment, but if we can recoup some of those moments for spontaneous thought, we may have more
Yeah.
opportunities for moments of joy. We
Yeah.
may encode memories better. We may have mood that is lifted more frequently.
I love it. So, sort of boredom as a kind of creative prompt in a way.
They can be.
Yeah. 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 I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Um, so, I did. Uh, I did ask some of my friends on Facebook, actually, talking about social media, what they'd like me to ask you. So I'll come on to a couple of those questions. Um, I mean, I suppose before we do that, just sort of because they're a bit more not quite random, but they're not related
That's
to your
okay.
book
Yeah.
quite. The final thing I must ask you about the book, of course, is well, your prescription, which is on the cover there, your sort of minimum required dosage. I think you say for training attention. This is based on lots of studies, and you've got three types of meditation. One which is very much about, I guess, using that flashlight, focusing on breathing and the experience of the body. One that's much more open. I think you call it open monitoring, and one that's more around connection. Well, these are three types of meditation that you. Could you just tell us this extraordinary minimum required dose? It'll be a great relief to a lot of us who think we have to meditate for an hour a day. So, tell us a bit about that, Amishi.
Well, let me just preface this by saying, probably a great idea to meditate an hour a day. Um,
Right.
because it's still the case that the more you practice, at least in our hands, in our data set, the more you benefit. But part
Right.
of the whole motivation, because it's a strange project, most people don't set out to study meditation to say, what's the absolute minimum I need to do? Right? It's
Yes.
usually like you want to see what contemplative practice is doing. You want to understand the nature of its capacity to change the brain. And there's no real reason to think doing the absolute minimum is going to do anything useful. But I had a very practical set of considerations because I was working in our research with groups that don't have a lot of time pressured, high
Yeah.
demand professionals. And if I suggested to them that they should do an hour a day, they would say, "Thank you very much. See you later, ma'am." Like, it was not even going to be the
Yes.
starting point of a conversation. And the other thing that was happening is that they had decided what they thought the minimum dose was. We're going to do 3 minutes. If I asked to come in to do an 8-hour training, they'd say, we'll give you an hour. Right. So there are ways in which minimum dose is going to be imposed upon you from the structures and organizational leadership you
Yeah.
engage with. So I basically said, I don't know yet if me coming in for an hour or 4 hours is beneficial for your time at all. It may be a complete waste of time to do that. So let's write a series of grants which allow us to see what is the minimum amount of time and what are the kinds of minimum amount of type of content we should include so that we see tractable benefits, especially as it relates to attention, mood, etc.
Yeah.
And so just to say that's where it comes from. It's not like some kind of a default that says do the least you can. That's not really.
No, I understand.
Because in some levels, if you think about the nature of research that's done with contemplative practice, it actually went to the other extreme. Most of the initial studies were done with, you might call the Olympians of meditation, people that spent 22,000 to 44,000 hours. It's like 22 years of one's life. Engaging in continuous, not in one sitting, but continuous practice.
Yeah.
So we knew when we started our work that is going to result in tractable benefits. But what about less time? So, the model that we had started out with was sort of mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which were the most broadly available manualized programs out there. And that's about 8 hours of training, meeting with the trainer 2 to 2.5 hours a week, and then 45 minutes of daily practice for the 8 weeks of the program. So that was a known kind of starting point. But now we're going to work in these contexts. We kept the amount of time, still the week's 8 hours. We kept the amount of training time, still about 24, 28 hours. We cut the amount of practice time down to 30 minutes. And then we said, be honest with us. And these were, by the way, pre-deployment Marines. That was our group. And that point that said, this is what we're prescribing you, but please, when we give you this little card that tells you to actually fill it in, know that that's precious data to us. Be honest with us of what you actually did. Now, of course, we do it through apps. We don't even need to ask them to be honest. We're just tracking how many times they click on our icon to do the practice. Nobody was doing 30 minutes a day, really. Like, it was just not happening. They'd show up to class, but they were not doing the practice. And then we saw there was a whole range of how much people practice. Some practiced 0. There were a couple that practiced 30 minutes many days, but not every day. And then all the types of variability you might see in between. So instead of saying, does it work or not work? Or is it effective or not effective? We decided to do what we call an exploration of a dose response effect. Does how much they did have an impact on the nature of the benefits that we saw? And that's where the basic result that allowed me to start this part of the conversation by saying doing an hour is probably a great idea, because what we saw was the more people practiced, the more they benefited, meaning the stronger their attention was, the better their mood was relative to those that did less. So that was great. But then I wanted to ask the second part of the question, at what point did it really start kicking in and matter? Meaning that we saw that they looked like it was either protecting them from decline in their attention over high stress intervals, or they were actually getting better than where they started. And that threshold was about 12 minutes a day. Okay, but more was better and less was really not having an effect.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That was 12 minutes a day. And then in the subsequent studies, what we did is we actually prescribed them 12 minutes a day. We didn't even say 30 minutes. And what we saw was that when we prescribed them 12 minutes a day, they were more likely to do it. And people that did not every day, but about 3 to 5 days a week, we saw that they were benefiting. So that's what it was. It's a very practical thing. It's like, okay, if you do this, it's like a good ballpark, almost like, in the US, we've got these like couch to 5K trainings where you're sedentary. But what's the amount you should do? It's not couch to 1K. It's not couch to 0.5K. It's couch to 5K. There is a threshold you should try to aim for. And in that train up, you will benefit. So it's that version of it. Of course, you can go on to run a marathon. You don't have to stick to 5K in your life. And that's the invitation, is let's get you to this point where we start seeing protective effects. And then sky's the limit. Do what you'd like to do. And so that is the encouragement, is to really say, if you can incorporate this in, even in the busy periods of your life, to stick to that sort of 12-minute daily dozen minimum, it's a good chance that you're keeping your attention protected and healthy.
Yeah, terrific. Well, I'm saying that because I'm aware that a lot of people watching this may not meditate yet, or may have tried to start meditation practice and failed. So I'm hoping that, joking aside, is actually quite encouraging.
I hope
for people,
so.
that even with just 12 minutes a day.
It's been interesting to me to hear from so many long-term practitioners that it kind of, hearing that kind of rekindled their long-term. Like, oh, I can get back on and then you realize, oh, maybe I don't want to stick to 12. Maybe I want to start doing 20 or 30 minutes again. So
Yeah,
it's an
absolutely.
invitation to say, let's see if we can get to this 12 minutes to get going again, or for the first time.
Yeah. Um, okay, so one of the questions from one of my friends, I feel a bit awkward asking it, but it's I'm sure you must get asked it before, but I'm aware that a lot of your studies have been with people in the military, large scale studies, and of course, a lot of people, or some people may ask, and certainly at least one or two people have asked me, well, what are the ethics and a way of helping soldiers be more mindful? Now, it's a complex question because you know, it's not clear that a Buddhist, certainly as a Buddhist speaking, I'm very glad we have an army and, to defend the UK, it's not straightforward sort of anti-military, but still, clear that's a question. Is what I guess the question is, what are your reflections on? Yeah, I guess the ethics of
Yeah.
of helping soldiers be more mindful. When, of course, we know what soldiers are called on to do a lot of time, which of course is to kill people. So if we're helping them do that more effectively, anyway, you can see I'm struggling to even frame the question, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. So I'll just be interested in your
Absolutely.
reflections.
It's a consideration that I didn't walk into studying military service members by accident. I mean, it was all deliberate. You don't write multi-million-dollar grants by accident, and nobody's
Yeah,
handing
sure.
you money
Yeah.
for no reason. So, just to give you a little bit about my personal background, that actually did shape a lot of my motivation here. So, and it's interesting talking. I spoke in the UK Parliament about this work that we've been doing with the military. Very interesting, because I was actually born in the town that was sort of Gandhi's headquarters. Gandhi's
Oh,
ashram
yes. Yeah.
is in the city, well, not really town, but city that I was born in, Ahmedabad. And so this
Oh,
notion
yes.
of nonviolence, ahimsa, is like part of the cultural spiritual thread of my upbringing. And
Mm,
I didn't know anybody in the military when I started this work. Nobody. I didn't have a family member, friends. It was not part of my circles at all. But
mm,
I knew because in my mind, and this has always been part of my consideration, ahimsa or nonviolence doesn't mean inaction. It doesn't mean do nothing. It really means take into consideration how you can behave in a way that would minimize violence in the world. And in many
yeah.
ways, I kept thinking, if you want to minimize violence in the world, um, well, what are the sources of violence in the world? War was a big one,
Yeah.
and um, do I live in a world where there is war? Yes. Do I live in a country where there is an army? Yes. Will I be single-handedly able to prevent the existence of armies and wars? No, I wish I could. I can't. So these are the preconditions. Like I live in a world where this is happening. I live in a country where this is the case. And so now,
Mm,
if the intention I still hold is how do you behave in a way that would minimize the existence of violence in our world, go to the sources that may be called upon or engaged in
sure. Yeah.
proliferating violence. And if they have better access to be more discerning in their decision making, be less reactive in their emotional response, and actually see each other as human beings that are connected, all three of those practices that you were talking about, if we can offer
Mm,
that to people who happen to have a weapon that can destroy an entire city that we as a country have endorsed them holding in their hands, the chances of senseless and proliferation of violence will increase or
yeah. Yeah.
decrease. Excuse me.
Yes.
And that's the intention. The intention is if you have an 18-year-old who's been given a weapon that could destroy an entire town, would you rather have that person have mindfulness skills or not? That's the question.
Well, when you put it like that, yeah.
And in my mind, it was yes, we want to do
Indeed.
that. We want to do it in the most
Yes.
efficient manner, and it's been very
Yeah.
interesting. It's a what I've realized, and it really shows me how naive I was, is that it's members of the military themselves who want peace, who
Right.
they are the front lines for violence. It's in their best interest to promote nonviolent
Mm,
solutions. And so, if you look at
yeah.
what's happening right now with Ukraine, there are things that are happening in the world that the rest of the world says are unacceptable, and military pressure and involvement will occur if you have leaders and members who see the value of peace, de escalation, nonviolence,
Mm,
collaborative solutions. You
Mm.
want that. You want that as much as possible. And I do see what we're
Mm.
doing and these efforts as seeding that within
Yeah.
very powerful institutions that without that input could really um, not advantage peace in the world.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of really sort of moving examples in your book. Actually, there's one where there's a platoon or whatever, a group of soldiers with permission to knock out this particular kind of
Encampment.
gathering of
Yeah.
people who were assumed to be Taliban. Yeah, that's right, an encampment in Afghanistan. And it was only, I don't know if it was someone you trained or not, but it was only hit a particular soldier's um, sort of questioning of are they really Taliban, and wanting to scout and go ahead and actually really question the story that everybody else was believing, that they were Taliban, and they realized they were just a
Veteran
Bedouin tribe.
tribe.
They weren't soldiers at
Yeah.
all.
I mean, this soldier,
Really.
by the way, to answer your question, this was not somebody that we had trained, but had
Oh, okay.
intrinsic
Yeah.
mindfulness. And it was seeing this kind of behavior in one of his soldiers that allowed the leader to then partner with us in the very first study ever done, offering mindfulness
Right.
training
Yeah.
to US Army
Yeah.
service members. So he
Yeah.
saw what that capability intrinsic in someone's mind can do. And he wondered whether we could grow that capability by training. So it was a
Yeah.
very, very
Good.
poignant
Good.
example. But I mean, if you think about what that soldier actually did, just to give a little more color to what you're saying, is essentially there was a very strong story held by everybody that
Yeah.
this is the nature of
Yeah.
this group. They're a Taliban, they're
Yeah.
enemy, we've got to destroy them.
Yeah.
And what that soldier
Yeah.
actually did is he saw what was. He opened his eyes to what was before him. He
Yes.
noticed,
Yeah.
the cues that would tell you this is a warring group of people versus not, is that he noticed that there were no weapons in any of these people they was seeing.
Yes.
And he was a scout at the front of the group coming up. It's like there are no weapons. And he ended up just given that, thinking, this is not what I think it is. I'm questioning my story now. And he just tackled one of
Mm.
the guys, and it ended up this all these people came out of the tents there, and a very robust looking woman kind of screaming and yelling like, let go of my let go of my men, like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
That's when they discovered it
Yeah.
was it was not a
Yeah.
Taliban
Yeah.
encampment, it was a
Yeah. No.
veteran
Yeah.
tribe. But I just think about that, think about all the different times when it could have easily gone another way, so many lives
Yeah.
would have been
Sure.
lost. This is what I mean by
Yeah.
seeing if we can touch into the sources of the proliferation of violence
Yeah.
to move it in a different direction.
Yeah. 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 Okay, another question from my friends. Just moving on. I've probably got another 5-10 minutes, so I just wanted to ask a couple more questions, if I may. Ian McGilchrist was one of our speakers earlier in the project, Nature of Mind project, and he, of course, is I don't know if he's known to you, but he's famous for his work on the two hemispheres, the brain and their different sort of the different ways that they work. Sorry, my words are failing me, but anyway, I suppose what would be interesting is to know whether, to what extent your work crosses over with that kind of thinking. I mean, for example, we have the phrase in our vernacular, "A picture tells 1,000 words," and my very, very layman's understanding is, like, for example, the right hemisphere is more likely to operate on the basis of images, the left on the basis of words. That may be wrong, but I'd be very interested to know to what extent there's a crossover there between your work on the attention systems of the mind and this idea of the two hemispheres working in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, um, this is a very important topic to understand how the brain is organized and how it happens. Just want to say that we don't want to confuse very sophisticated research regarding hemispheric specialization of function to sort of the popular view that, well, you're a right brain person or a left brain person. Right
Yes, I
brain
know.
meaning, you're
Yes.
artsy and you
Yeah.
care about this, and left
Yeah.
brain, you're logical and this and that.
Yeah.
Those notions are false.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
cannot attribute complex human personality profiles and actions to a single hemisphere. The brain is a highly interconnected, dynamic organ, and we've got this giant bridge called the corpus callosum between two hemispheres. So there's constant back and forth. So I just want to say
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
what has been described as hemispheric specialization is not the same as popular lay notions of
Yeah.
right brain, left brain, because those are false. do not believe them. And when I say that in many crowds, they're like, "What do you mean? I'm not right brain to left brain." Nobody's denying that you may have a particular way in which you engage in your life, but that's not attributable to one hemisphere doing soul work on that behalf, right? So
Mm.
it's absolutely the case that in the context of attention, there are hemispheric specializations as well. And we know this from patients that have strokes, unilateral strokes. So if they have a
Mm.
stroke in the right, we see some things, and when they have stroke in the left, we see other things, and we can start understanding how the brain is organized to be able to do certain things. But I would say that's not my particular interest. I'm much more practically
Sure.
minded, where I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand, at this point, because we've been doing so much work kind of out in the field, working with people to bring mindfulness practices, to see the impact of those practices in their real life, whether they are leaders of industry or education, or members of various professions. Um, Even the brain basis at this point is sort of less central to my work um,
Yeah.
than understanding just if there are benefits and how to benefit people the
Yeah.
most from this work. There are
Sure.
aspects of what my lab does that's very interested in brain function, but it's really on the level of understanding the nature of how mental states proliferate. So gets into a little bit of an esoteric sort of Buddhist terrain of the contingent nature of reality. And if one
Mm.
moment in time really sets the stage for the next moment in time, and what happens in moment, n plus one is really determined by what just happened a moment ago. How does it look like? How does that look in the brain? And what we realize is the brain too is sort of a contingent organ. And we do this using EEG. So we're not just looking at like, larger time windows. We're looking at these thousands of seconds, something called microstates. And what we see is that microstates actually have this sort of contingent nature. So I'm very interested in that aspect of it, but it has to do more with mind wandering and attention, more so than its hemispheric nature.
And what that I mean, that's really piqued my interest. What you just said about this contingent reality of the brain. I mean, what do you see a difference in the brains of people who are really, well, either very experienced meditators, or even, I mean, I don't know how you would measure wisdom, but people who've attained quite deep wisdom or insight into the contingent nature of reality, you could say. I mean, goodness knows how you would measure that, but is there anything that you can sort of see objectively through an ECG or a brain scan?
Yeah, I would say I'm now commenting on the broader field of contemplative
Yeah.
neuroscience. And yes, we are learning a lot about this. What we know, for example, is that it's not so much about this contingent state. That has happened very little of.
Okay.
But just to say in broad strokes, yes, long-term practitioners have particular nodes in their brain that have increased what's called cortical thickness. You can almost think about it as like
Okay.
certain muscle groups are stronger because they're working them out. That's the
Right.
way of thinking about it. We know that interconnection between certain brain networks is better. The dynamics are smoother. And we talked about mind wandering. We know what the brain network that really is involved in mind wandering, or this internally directed attention. And with long term and even short term practice, you can see that activation in that network, something called the default mode network, which is actually multiple
Yes.
subnetworks, it can get dialed down. So we see things are making sense. Like the thing that's part of the training is showing up in the way that the brain looks. This question that I'm talking about really is not even about contemplative training. It's about just the nature of how the brain operates. So if you know that there's a particular microstate, configuration of neurons that are showing you, there's stability, almost a mind moment, if you will. And that mind
Yeah.
moment by mind moment configuration um, has a temporal contingency. It's likely to be the same. And so if you're in state one in these microstates, you're likely to be in state one in the next
Right.
moment. And the chances of you flipping to a different state are lower than you staying in the same state. And flipping to
Right.
certain
Right.
specific states is even lower. So, like to go from a very focused state to a completely open state, very unlikely.
Ah, right.
So, you
Yeah.
might go from
Yeah. Yeah.
focused to a
Yeah.
little less focused, but going from focused to totally unconstrained, very unlikely. So, this is how I think it actually relates to of some very interesting Buddhist concepts of even what it means to have long term practice in terms of your tethering to mental contingency. So, for example, if you think about what, I'm now totally speculating, but if you think about what enlightenment is, to be
Mm.
truly free, what
Mm.
does that look like in terms of a brain configuration? one hypothesis may be you don't need to have those contingencies. You can go from state highly
Mm,
focused to totally not focused. You can go to any dimension with ease and without that
yeah,
kind of compulsion to be tied into what's going on.
yeah.
Now, we don't know, but it would be interesting to see even how contemplative practice, long term or short term, impacts the contingencies between these microstates as a way to understand more fundamentally how practicing frees us in some sense.
That sounds fascinating. And if you could, I don't know, get some very real adepts. I mean,
Yeah,
of course, you can't get the Buddha himself into your, but some real adepts and see. I mean, are you yet in a position to be able to see those differences
yeah.
in? Sorry, I can't remember the terminology. These contingencies, these
Microstates, yeah, temporal contingencies in
microstates. Yeah,
microstates. Yes, we could. And yes,
yeah.
this would be such an exciting project to do. But I'll tell
Wow.
you, the
Yeah,
Department of Defense or the National Institutes of Health probably wouldn't fund it. So I need somebody that would want to, put some funds into being able to explore this and then get the right kind of participants at various stages of their practice trajectory to
yeah,
see, are we seeing something along the lines of my hunch, which is that contingencies may be less um, biased in this way um,
yeah,
in people that have more and more practiced. Because in some sense, we know the contingencies, meaning you're in one state and you stay in that state may be tied to even your psychological health. So it's not
yeah,
like you want to
yeah,
dissolve temporal contingencies and you may have a completely
yeah,
disorganized brain, but they may be changing in predictable ways. That could be so
yeah.
interesting to understand. And maybe,
Right. So if there's
oh,
any,
yeah,
I was going to say, if there's any really super wealthy Buddhists out there, if Elon Musk is secretly a Buddhist or whatever it is, then right, let's fund this study. This
I think it'd
sounds
be
terrific.
fascinating to, it's like one of those
Yeah,
pet ideas of like, oh, if somebody ever asked me, I just happen to have an extra $1 million. How do you want to spend it? This would be one of those things I
yeah,
would do because
brilliant.
it's
It's only $1 million. Come on, we can do that.
but it's
Someone out there's got a spare
It's
million
really the
watching
merging of
this.
Buddhist thought and psychology and contemporary neuroscience. And that coming together is, to me, such an exciting area.
That I mean, that is a really wonderful note to finish on. I'm just really delighted to get to that point. I mean, I've enjoyed the whole the whole discussion, so I really want to thank you, Amishi. I mean, just very generous with your time, and personally, I found it fascinating. I hope those whoever's watching this has also found it really fascinating. And yeah, I really highly recommend Dr. Jha's book, Peak Mind, and in fact, even it's very practical, as you said, you're a very practical person because right at the back there's even like a week by week kind of plan of how to develop a meditation practice. So yeah, thank you very much again. I say really appreciate your time. And is there any last thing you want to leave us with, like the crucial thing I didn't ask you about, or like
Oh,
your
yeah.
parting advice, perhaps?
I would say just thank you. This is really such a delight, and I really appreciated your
Oh,
questions and your friends' questions, and not really nothing you missed, but just to want to say that these conversations of people that are spending, our day lives are probably spent in a lot of different headspace. And I don't know what you do, day to day, but I'm assuming it's not what I do, which is in a lab studying, you know,
I'm a fundraiser, which is why I was.
may it be so, may it be so, especially for this project. But what I'm saying is the coming together of people that share this love for the nature of the mind, the nature of reality from different perspectives is such a valuable thing to do. And I just
Yeah.
want to share my real gratitude and appreciation for you creating a platform where we can come together in this way
Oh,
and have these conversations. So please keep going. And I'm really honored to be able to be part of this conversation.
well, thank you again. And for anyone who's watching, you can carry on this conversation in the sense because there'll be a seminar where Maitra Bandhu and I will discuss what Amishi and I have been exploring, and there'll be a chance to ask questions as well. So do tune in for that. Thanks again, Amishi, and yeah, wish you well the rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.